Hi everyone. I just wanted to welcome you to Philosophy 45 on civility and or democracy and civility. And I wanted to thank you and apologize for the inconvenience of missing class today. As you can imagine, it was pretty important to spend time with my family today, especially my mom, who's not doing particularly well. Anyway, I do apologize seriously for the inconvenience on the first day of class. I suppose if there's a class that you had to miss, the first day is not a bad one. Um, all things considered, at least it doesn't mess up the schedule. Let me just go through the preliminary things of part of the class, and then I'll introduce some of the questions that the quarter's about. So first of all, the class fulfills your civic engagement core requirement, so I would imagine that's why most of you are taking it, which is fine. That's exactly, or that's primarily why I created the class in the first place. Um, and the way the class will be set up is if you go on Camino right now, you can see the schedule and the syllabus are there. And I will give you hard copies of both on Wednesday and we'll go over them. But in terms of the schedule, all 10 weeks are already laid out. There are quizzes every day on the reading for that day, which includes Wednesday, as I said in the email this morning. So, for example, the quiz on Wednesday will be on Held 260 to 267 and 281 now to 284 and 290 to 292. Now you notice Held, you can see the books that are required at the top. Held or Models of Democracy, Tolerance Among the Virtues, and the Outrage Industry, which means you have to buy the books right away. So because you're going to need, the first book you're going to need to read from is for Wednesday's quiz. So make sure you go get those books right away. The bookstore tends to sell things back too quickly anyway. So so make sure you go ahead and get the books, and that's the reading for Wednesday. Do that reading twice if you can, and then be prepared to answer questions on it. It says in the syllabus what I require for the quizzes. They're not meant to trick you, but they're just to make sure that you've done the reading carefully and closely. Um, the quizzes are on the schedule. Like I said, there's one every day on the reading for that day. You get to drop your 3 lowest quizzes, and I'll come back to that in a second. Please note the dates. You'll have an exam, you have a small paper, and you have the final exam, which will be taken online. So you don't have to even be at school, as far as I'm concerned, to take it. And then there's a presentation that's required. I don't like personally requiring students to have presentations, but civic engagement core requirement kind of requires it. So there'll be a day where you'll be part of a group at the end of the quarter going through some of the material in class and doing a presentation that's worth 10% of your grade. The reading quizzes are worth 35% of your grade, so they're taken very seriously, so that you come to class, be prepared to do the reading. And and the syllabus talks about that there's 3 absences allowed. You can have any absences for any reasons, but just any after 3, I will require medical documentation. So don't use them up and early on, and then ask for um, uh, some excuse or something, because I need you in class. This is an important class and an important core requirement. And so you have 3 absences allowed, and you also get to drop your 3 lowest quizzes. So those match up perfectly. Of course, if you're in class every day, taking the reading or doing the reading and taking the quizzes every day, well then the 3 quizzes that are dropped are your 3 lowest quiz scores rather than your 3 zeros for having missed class. So that's exactly what I want to incentivize. I want to incentivize you to be in class and be prepared to do the quizzes. The exam is worth 20% of your grade. The quizzes, as I just said, are worth 35%. The small paper is worth 20%, and the final is worth 15%, and presentation is worth 10%. And I will go over this again on Wednesday rather quickly, but if you want, you can take a look on Camino at this on the syllabus and the schedule, and let me know if you have any questions, or you can email me and ask me if you have any questions that you might have. But basically, it's a pretty straightforward class. I think it's a very, very interesting topic. And what I would have done the first day of class had we been together, what I planned to do was to have this discussion of, well, and talk about how the quarter will be laid out, which is the first part is on democracy, like the first third. What is it? So some questions that you might have is that, and I will talk about this on Wednesday, but if you think about it, democracy is not primarily about voting. Or if it is about voting, it's about voting as a means to an end. So democracy is about how, it's really about five things. How voting conveys the will of the people, and how their will then affects law, which is 3, then 4, which then has legitimacy because it comes from the will of the people, and therefore people ought to follow it. So democracy has at its core, it's not just a form of government. It's because if you think about it, it's just there's all different kinds of government. Why do people want to fight for democracy? Why do people want to march for democracy? Why do people want to, as was attributed to, I think an American, or it was actually the president in World War I saying to make the world safe for democracy, fighting World War I. And so the first part of the quarter is, what is democracy? For example, another thing we'll talk about is there's 2 very essential things to distinguish that people don't often distinguish, which is what democracy is. So, for example, this free act of voting, dealing with the will of the people, transitive, where the voting then conveys the people's will, and then the majority rules. Those are all aspects of what democracy is. So let's say that's one thing. But the second thing is what democracy provides. For example, prosperity, rights, less warfare, freedom, order. Those are not democracy. Those are what democracy leads to or provides. So keep fundamentally separate what democracy is and what democracy provides. And people often confuse those 2 or make those 2 into one thing, but they're not one thing. They're 2 different things. What democracy is and what democracy provides, or what democracy creates. Okay? So keep those separate. And so the first part of the quarter is all these questions about what democracy is, its history, its requirements, all of those kind of things. And we will look into also what it provides, but primarily we'll be dealing with the first question of the 2, which is what it is. And then second part of the quarter is we'll be dealing with tolerance as related to civility. And what is tolerance? Is it a virtue? And we'll be reading that book, A Tolerance Among the Virtues, which is a difficult book, but we'll be reading it closely. And as you can see on the schedule, some of those assignments are like 10 pages. They're very short, but we'll be going through that in some detail, dealing with tolerance as a kind of very close brother or sister to civility, and using it that way. And then we'll be looking at how, if civility is necessary for democracy, well, then we'll be looking at, through the third book, The Outrage Industry, how people then try to actually use economics and economic incentives to make money off of being uncivil. And if that's true, then are they also undermining democracy? So if democracy requires civility and there's an economic incentive to be uncivil, then is there an economic incentive eventually to undermine democracy? And if that's the world you and I live in, how do we make arguments for why that's wrong or problematic? And how do we understand the world that's around us? And how do we understand how to engage in the upholding of important institutions, especially if democracy, I told you how to keep them separate, what it is and what it provides, but if it is shown that democracy does provide for rights and does provide for prosperity, and maybe even as a necessary condition for rights or prosperity or order or freedom, and those are all things that we hold to be sacrosanct and essential to a life well lived and to thriving, then if democracy is necessary for those things, then anything that undermines democracy is incredibly problematic. Well, if that's true, then we should be able to articulate reasons to uphold democracy, to support democracy, to give a argument in favor of it, and be able to look at the various parameters or attributes of it. Okay, so this part, and this will be a relatively small class. There's not a lot of people in it, so hopefully we'll have a lot of discussion. And people will feel free to disagree with me and disagree with each other and engage in civil, that's the name of the class, civil disagreement, which is fine, because we learn a lot more when people disagree with us than we do when people agree with us, because we're forced to articulate our position and to think things through. Okay, so that's the basic layout of the course, and we would have had those discussions today about, again, things like, is civility required for democracy? Should the will of the people, for example, if you say it's majoritarian, well, and democracy is legitimate and ought to be followed, the laws that are a product of democracy and the will of the people, and we ought to follow them because those laws come from the people, well, why should it be only 50%? Maybe we should only follow laws that correspond to the will of 70% of the people. So imagine a proposition that's on the ballot and it only becomes the law when 80% of the people are in support of it, not just 50%. And if you think about that, that's a difficult question. Why 50? More than not. Okay, but that's not a very convincing argument of like, well, 51 people agree with me and 49 disagree with me. That seems to me to be not a very strong argument of why we ought to go with the 51. So why is it a majority and not just a simple majority, and not a majority of 80% or 90%? Why just 50%? If the idea is that democracy and law should flow from the will of the people, well, is it truly the will of the people when it's only 50%? Especially when it's only 50% of those who vote, and it's only 50% of those who vote and can vote. So if you have all of the people, and then you take out all of the people who, and then you say, okay, well, here's all the people. Now there's all the people. So let me see if I can do this right. So if you say this is all of the people, and then this is all of the people who can vote, excluding felons and children and others, and then there's only 50% of the people who can vote do vote, and you only get 50% of that 50%, now you're looking at the will of the people corresponding to less than 25% of the people. Okay? That would change if you made it a requirement of it be 60% majority or 70%. So again, I want to say that again because it's not obvious. If you have all of the people in society, all of them, and then you say, okay, well, here's all of the people who can vote. Let's say that's down to 70% if you exclude children, those under 18, and felons and others. And then of the 70%, you only need 50%, only 50% of them do vote. Now you're down to 35%, and you get only half of the 35%. Then you have laws made from the will of the people corresponding to only 17%, if I did my math right. Okay? So is that enough to show that the laws reflect and they should take their legitimacy from the fact that they correspond to the will of the people? So we'll be talking about that as well. Can democracy, because it seems to change and the people's mind change, can it undermine order? Can it undermine predictability? Shouldn't law be predictable? Shouldn't law be, and isn't law's predictability tied to its sense of order? Shouldn't law provide order? Well, does democracy undermine that? And so those are the questions that we will be talking about, and I'll go over this a lot on Wednesday, but I just wanted to throw out some questions for you to think about. It's much more complicated than you think. It's much more complicated than is obvious. For example, one more example. Democracy is required upon boundaries. You don't say the will of the people. The will of the people of Nevada do not get to make the laws for California. You say, okay, well, it's only the people within those boundaries. Okay, but who draws the boundaries? California is probably 30 times the size of Massachusetts. But a person 1 foot outside, living 1 foot outside the boundaries of Massachusetts doesn't get to vote for the people of Massachusetts. So you say, well, the people of Santa Clara County will decide who the county supervisors would be. Okay, but the boundaries of Santa Clara County just happen to be this. Why are they that and not some other boundaries? Why is San Francisco's boundaries this or San Jose's boundaries that? But it's the will of the majority within that boundary. Well, why that boundary? And so that gets incredibly complicated as well. So think about that democracy is the will of the people, but it's also the will of the people within, you could argue, an arbitrary boundary. Are the people of California fundamentally different than the people of Nevada? Or when two cities are close to each other, are the people of Portland, Oregon fundamentally different than the people a mile away from Vancouver, Washington? But the people of Vancouver, Washington choose the governor of Washington. The people of Portland, Oregon choose the governor of Oregon. But they're only a mile apart. But yet they completely separate in terms of the laws they have to follow. One's from Olympia, the other one's from Salem. But the cities are right next to each other. But because the boundary line is between the two cities, the will of the people means that the Vancouver is similar to the people in Spokane and Seattle and Tacoma and Bellingham, and the people of Portland are similar to the people in Medford and Grants Pass and Salem and Eugene. And you think, but wait a second, all of a sudden now Portland is being tied to Medford and Vancouver is being tied to Spokane, but they're only a mile apart. There's the rivers between them. Yep, that's it. So the will of the people, you want to say is okay, is reflected in the boundaries, but is it really reflected in some sort of fundamental difference between the two parties or the two populaces? And I think the answer clearly is no. So then you want to say, well, then why, how do it seems to me you need to have boundaries in order for democracy to work. But then the problem is you need boundaries for a democracy to work. And so the will of the people really means the will of the people within that boundary. So we'll be talking about that as well. So as usual, typical in philosophy, there's tons of things to think about. And I don't have answers to most of them, but I do think they're worth thinking about. And I do think it's worth, we say in philosophy, problematizing or thinking these things through or raising the issues so that we can maybe meet some of these objections, especially if we think that democracy and the rule of law and all the other things that are linked together in civilization are worth fighting for, because I do think they are worth fighting for. And so we'll be talking about that as well as the links to civility throughout the quarter. Okay? All right, so I will pay attention to my email to see if you all have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you on Wednesday. And sincerely, I thank you for putting up with the inconvenience of me not being there the first day. I really don't like to miss class, but I think I made the right decision morally and everything for my family. And so I'll see you on Wednesday.